Welcome back to this week's episode of The True Presbyterian. I am Hutch, and my guest today is Chris Wiley. So, Pastor Wiley wears a lot of hats. He co hosts the Theology podcast with Glenn Sunshine, who is also going to be appearing this season, God willing. We're going to be talking with him about the need to fight for a Christian magistrate. He is also a pastor in the Presbyterian Church in America, and he has written for a wide variety of publications, including Modern Reformation, the National Review Online, as well as First Things, among others. And he is also the author of the book that we're discussing today, which is The Household and the War for the Cosmos, Recovering a Christian Vision for the Family, which is this little book right here. And if you are so inclined, you can find it at Canon Press's website or wherever fine books are sold. So, Chris, I want to welcome you to the show, brother. Thank you for joining me.
Well, thanks for having me, Hutch. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Well, I am very appreciative for you giving us your time. I know that you're a busy guy. So let's start with this. Since today's topic is directly related to the topic of your book, and what we're doing this season is talking about the need to fight for the future. In this episode specifically, we're going to be talking about the need to fight for the family. So what is it that motivated you to write a book about the need to recover a Christian vision for the family?
Well, I think it's a couple of things. One is I come from a broken home, and so it's been a subject that I've reflected on a lot, primarily because I didn't grow up in a healthy household. So, and I didn't grow up in a Christian household. So those things were important to me as I thought about it. But also, I over the course of my ministry, I began in the ministry back in the late 80s. I've seen a steady erosion of commitment to biblical norms with regard to household life. And that didn't all get started in the 80s. I mean, there's been a long sort of lead up to that, but it's broadened. The decay has gotten more, I think, alarming. And so, for those reasons, I thought, well, I should think about this subject and do my best to see if I can't make an argument for the traditional household.
Folks, before we continue, I want to invite you, please do go to www.patreon.com/thetruepresby, where you can become a patron of the show for as little as $5 a month, which frankly is dang near free. So, in your book, In Household and the War for the Cosmos, one of the things that you say is that the apparent solidity of the norms of the 1950s were just an illusion. So what norms were you speaking about, and how were they illusory?
Well, I think for many people, when they want to make a straw man out of the traditional household, they'll hold the 1950s up as exemplary. In other words, a time in which everybody was in agreement about the importance of white picket fences and well-manicured lawns and dad working 9 to 5 and that kind of stuff. First of all, detractors, people who criticize traditional households, in other words, progressives, they're attacking something that was already sick. It was a dead man walking. It looked sort of good, kind of like a corpse that's been painted up for a funeral, but it was already dead. It was already gone. What I'm getting at is that the traditional household had already been sort of gutted, and what you had was a facade. And the facade consists of, stereotypically dad getting into his car, driving off to work, working 9 to 5, mom staying home, maybe eating bonbons, watching television, sending kids off to public school, that kind of stuff, maybe being involved in the PTA and a few other local, sort of parent associations or neighborhood associations. But it was a consumerist household, not a productive household, and that is the primary difference between what we know today and what had been in place around the world in different cultures for time out of mind. What had been in place were productive households. And what I mean by productive households we can get into, but I think that what you had is essentially a guy who worked for somebody else, who maybe had a living wage, maybe even had a family wage, and all that. Those things are great. There were still some concessions at that time to the importance of stable home lives, or stable homes. That doesn't exist at all today. But what we have today is sort of an outworking of what was already kind of working through our culture during the 50s. So when I'm interacting with, when I'm talking to, debating with progressives, and they like to, and they bring up the 1950s and try to make fun of it, I say, I'm with you. I can make fun of it too. In fact, I can make fun of it better than you can. You don't even understand what was going on.
Yeah, I think that there's a good bit of misconception about the state of the family and the state of the home in the 1950s. And so I found that particular statement in your book. I think that was the moment as I was reading it where I went, okay, yeah, I'm sold now, because I think he's seeing some of the same things that others would see, and isn't blinded to the problems that already existed. So we're going to get into the question of productive household in just a minute. But before we do, I want to ask about this. As you see it, what are some of the modern misconceptions about the family and about the household that get read into the biblical text? So whether we're talking about Ephesians 5, or whether we're talking about another text that deals with household codes, maybe we're talking about Colossians 3, somewhere like that. What are some of those misconceptions from 2021 that are getting read back into the first century?
Yeah, we're guilty of eisegesis, as they say. We read back into we read it anachronistically.
Mm-hmm.
So the emphasis on the individual, that's the starting point for most people. Another thing that people assume is the case is that households were primarily sort of designed and intended to serve sort of your personal agenda, make you happy. Happy in a modern sense, not in eudaimonia, in the sense that the Greeks and Aristotle and folks like that thought. But basically, the household today, family life today, is about self-actualization. It's about self-gratification. It's about what's in it for me. And the reason why we can play that kind of game is because other institutions have developed in our world today, which have supplanted the practical sort of benefits of household life. So that today we tend to think of our households as, well, as I noted, just places where we, feel like we can let our hair down, be ourselves, surround ourselves with people we like being around. And we've lost what had been the case, up until maybe the middle of the 19th century, the productive household as something that gave you a living, sort of kept you alive.
Right.
And so consequently, everything's been downgraded. At the same time, everything has been sort of recast in this image that I noted, sort of in terms of personal gratification and self-actualization and that kind of stuff. So in like the 1920s and 30s, people who studied family life in the United States, sociologists, they talked about a transition from the traditional household and traditional marriage to companionate marriage. Companionate marriage was a way a label that they used to describe essentially kind of a friendship between, and I mean in the most sort of superficial way, of a man and a woman who kind of lived together and kept each other company, and maybe helped out with incidental things, but it was again. You were married because you wanted to have company, somebody who shared your interests, that kind of thing. It wasn't something that was absolutely essential, not just for life in general for individuals, but for society. Instead, it was just sort of an option if you're into that sort of thing. So you're into having a wife, Hutch. Some people are into having dogs. It's, it's just that's the way people think about it today. But that wasn't the way our ancestors thought about it at all. And in the New Testament, in the Old Testament, marriage was life and death. It was whether or not there would be another generation, obviously procreation, but also in terms of the way men and women and parents and children work together to provide for each other, create a home-centered economy.
One of the things that you just mentioned is the idea that this was a husband and a wife that had joined together with one another, basically as friends and companions, with the added benefit of a tax break. And one of the things that I find interesting that you didn't mention there, and I think that there's a reason for that, is the presence of children. And so, do you see that as part of this breakdown in our understanding of the household? Is the idea that we have separated the concept of marriage from children?
Oh yeah, definitely. I've not read Tim Keller's book on marriage, and I don't intend to.
That's a good thing.
But I've been told that he mentions children once.
Yeah.
Now, how many pages is that book? 300 or so?
Yeah, I want to say it's 300, 350, somewhere in there.
So essentially, Tim Keller is an apologist for companionate marriage. It's all about you. Now he'll wrap it up in the language of sanctification and stuff like that.
Sure.
But that turns it into, again, some kind of voluntary kind of thing. It's just a voluntary association if you're into that sort of thing. If you're not, hey, no biggie, single for Jesus, that kind of stuff.
Folks, if you are listening to this episode and you want to read a good book on marriage, I would recommend that you skip Tim Keller's and that you buy the 3-volume set that Reformation Heritage Books published a number of years ago. That's the sort of new edition of William Gouge's work on building a godly family. That is absolutely superb, and I recommend that you read it basically over any other marriage book that's been written in the last 50 to 100 years. Tim Keller's book on marriage is awful. There's just no nice way to say it. So now that we've gotten kind of that misconception in front of us, biblically speaking, what is a household?
Yeah, well, a household throughout the ancient world, and I think we have to frame it that way. It wasn't as though the patriarchs invented marriage. It wasn't as though they this is something that's a creation ordinance.
Mm-hmm.
We see it throughout the world. Now, there is a Christian way to do it.
Right.
And that's important to keep in mind. There's a Christian way to do it because Christ has redeemed marriage. And there are things that, because of the work of Christ, that we can see in marriage and use marriage for, that people didn't realize was the case prior to the advent of the Lord Jesus and his life, death, resurrection, and so forth. So anyway, so in antiquity, a household was a going concern. It was a working partnership between a husband and wife. They became within the framework biblically understood. They became one flesh.
Mm-hmm.
Now, one flesh. Is something. It's one of those very fecund or manifold descriptions for something that has many dimensions. So obviously, there's the sexual union, which is the when a marriage is consummated. People used to actually talk about it that way.
Yeah.
So a marriage was consummated by intercourse between a man and a woman. But the idea went beyond the physical union into a kind of larger sense that a common life, was shared between a husband and wife. This was the justification for a woman taking a man's name. This was also the justification for the pooling of assets. So there were no prenuptial agreements. All that kind of nonsense.
Right.
When a man and a woman came together, the debts, the assets, they're pooled and they're shared, and that's why when even today, people divorce, there's a tearing asunder, not only of the day-to-day pattern of life of a man and a woman, but also their assets,
Right.
pulling them apart. So, and then, of course, it also alludes to children. And children literally are the union of the flesh of a man and a woman. And a child proceeds from that union. And so then that child owes something to his or her parents. And that's something that follows that person throughout the course of his life until his parents leave this world. There are certain responsibilities that parents obviously have in terms of the care of of their children, but also there's a return that's expected, and this is what is implied in honor your father and mother in the Ten Commandments. So there's a sense in which there's this idea. So, for example, when we think about this, essentially the welfare state is a way of kind of ameliorating the kind of the long-term benefits of having children over an entire political state. So in the past, your 401k, your Social Security, that was your kids.
Right.
So you would, of course, ideally hand to your children the resources that would be required for them to care for you. So if you had a business, you had property, you had a farm or whatever,
Sure.
you didn't just simply place yourself in their care. You also gave them everything that they would need to take care of you. So, but when you have a welfare state, people who don't have kids benefit from sort of the productive work that the children of the next generation, the people of the next generation perform, and then that those funds are distributed. Now, somebody might say, "Well, I paid into Social Security," and that's true. But in case a person who's listening to this podcast isn't aware of it, there is no bank account where all that money is being held.
Right.
It comes in and it goes out. So it's the people today who are paying into Social Security who are taking care of the people who are drawing on Social Security at this moment. So anyway, and by the way, this is one of the reasons why, and this is well documented. I've come across 2 or 3 studies that establish this point. That's one of the reasons why fertility drops in nations that establish or institute a welfare state.
Interesting.
And it's also why you need new immigrants all the time. So, we talk a lot, in our world today about, sort of taking advantage of natural resources, sort of spending down sort of, the capital, so to speak, that is all around us in terms of, timber or what have you, oil. But the same thing's true in a modern economy when you're not producing enough people to actually keep the concern going,
Right.
and you have to import people all the time,
Right.
who are actually coming from parts of the world where they actually have kids.
Right.
And so we're basically ripping off Africa, the third world, all the time. It's a brain drain. We're taking
Yep.
their brightest and their best and sort of skimming them away all the time in the name of fairness and in the name of freedom of movement, in the name of whatever we're making a stand against xenophobia, whatever.
Right.
But what's actually happening is we're taking the best from around the world to prop up Western society.
Right. So I titled this episode Fight for the Family because it might not be terribly obvious to the listener. Would you mind talking just a little bit about what it is that we're fighting for when we say that we're fighting for the family?
Well, I want to make a distinction.
Okay.
And it's a distinction with a difference. but there is overlap between the family and the household. So a family, today we live in a time when even the biological dimensions of family life are brought into question. Love makes a family, that kind of stuff. It just happens to be whoever you feel a little affection for at the moment and actually are kind of living with at the moment that constitutes your family. Very unstable, constantly, in flux. But family life is biological in character. So when we talk about a natural family, we're talking about a husband and wife and their issue, which would be children. And then, of course, the extended relations if we're talking about an extended family. So I think, again, what we refer to as a nuclear family today is sort of boiling family life down to its bare minimum so that it's portable and is sort of fungible in the modern economy. We want to keep our commitments at a minimum so that we can move and take advantage of the next job somewhere else. But that even is breaking down, and that's one of the reasons why there's always something else going on whenever we hear or hear about some kind of cause, a popular cause at any given time. And those interests that are being served beneath the surface are the things that I think we as Christians should help to bring to the surface, corporate interests, etc. And they're always short-term thinking, when it comes to those short-term sort of, in terms of their thinking when it comes to those things, the people who are promoting these things. Anyway, getting back to the point, so a family is what I just described. It's what often comes to mind when we think about family life: husbands, wives, father, mother, children, grandparents, etc. A household, though, is a more formal structure. So a household comes with a head because there's work to be done. So historically, households were economies. In fact, the word economy is an English word that takes two Greek words, oikos and nomos, household law or house law, to describe sort of the pattern of life that is present in a productive household. And the reason why you have authority in a household as distinct from a family is because even though there is a need for authority in families, the way authority is exercised in a family can almost always be understood exclusively in terms of how it serves the interests of, say, children or the weak members of the family. Whereas in a household, what authority tends to address is the need to get things done. Because we have to live.
Sure.
We have to get the crops in. We need to get the cows milked. We need to get the shoes made if I'm a cobbler, or we need to get the pig iron out to the forge if I'm a smith.
Sure.
These kinds of things. So when you have that kind of practical, sort of pressing need to work and be productive, that calls for authority and its exercise in order to happen. So a lot of times when we're looking at the New Testament and the Old Testament and we see authority being exercised, it isn't in the service of the ego of the man who is the head of the house.
Right.
That can get mixed up in it, just like it can get mixed up in any productive enterprise. I mean,
sure.
we have lots of businesses and Fortune 500 companies that are driven by egomaniacs. But even the egomaniac has to be able to point at the bottom line and say, look, we got some stuff done. This wasn't just about making me look good. We got some stuff done. And likewise, when it comes to households, you had to get stuff done.
Right.
So anyway, I hope that helps in terms of there's obviously overlap. Families inhabit households, but households can also include non-family members.
Right. No, that's a helpful distinction. As a guy who grew up with a family that owned a tobacco farm, I am
Oh, there you go.
perfectly familiar with what it means that the household has to get stuff done. And so when it's time to set tobacco, or when it's time to crop tobacco, or when it's time to get it hung up and let it dry out and do all of those things, it didn't matter if you were 4 or 400, you were out there doing what needed to be done.
That's right.
So yeah, that was a norm of my childhood. So that makes a good bit of sense. Here's a question that I think kind of gets at the point of what we're trying to do in this episode. The common misconception is that the household codes of the New Testament, so once again, we'll take Ephesians 5 as our starting point, are kind of slapped on to the end of the letter like an afterthought. In the same way that often you'll hear a pastor preach a sermon and then slap all of the application on the end, and it's really clear that there wasn't a whole lot of thought that was put into the application. So why are those codes so central to the argument that Paul's making in Ephesians as the example?
Sure. Well, there are a couple of things to keep in mind, and that is within the Roman world at that time, households were really kind of the fabric of society. So, what Paul has to say at that point in Ephesians wouldn't have been considered extraneous. They would have been actually considered, sort of really central. But the arc of the letter actually is taking you to this all the way through. And something else to keep in mind is that, and this is where the title of the book comes from. In antiquity, in the classical world, people thought in terms of fractals. Now, the term fractal is a term that we, consider, or many people consider kind of dealing with a new idea. But it's actually something that's something quite old. And the idea is that everything mimics the next level of kind of reality. So, for example, when we talk about households, we can say that a state is like a household, and that the cosmos is like a state. In other words, there's a kind of a sense in which there are these kind of Russian nesting dolls. One resembles the other. But in terms of fractals, what you have is that there's a direct relationship between the household and the governing authority, and the governing authorities or authority, depending on your cosmology, that orders the larger, sort of the reality at the largest level. So the relationship between a household and the cosmos is that the household reflects the cosmos. And so what you have in Ephesians is you have the cosmos, which is Christ and the church, and then you have the visible church, and then you have human households, and each reflects the other. So the cosmos, the church, and then you have the visible church, I should say, and then you have particular households. So, but
Right.
these things relate to each other. So you can see kind of things moving in one or two directions. So either, well, this is the ideal, is that the way it was understood by both Romans and Christians, or pagans and Christians, is that at the highest level you have something that's real. And what you have in Scripture is Christ and the church,
Okay.
eschatologically understood. Okay, so what you have is the eschaton. It's the union, the one fleshness. Paul uses this he talks about the mystery. This is he tells us this is a profound mystery, Christ and the church. And then he kind of brings it back to sort of the ground, and he says, but we're talking about husbands and wives today. Right. So we're applying this. We're taking the cosmos and we're applying it to the household. Mm-hmm. So there's kind of a trickle down. And local churches, local bodies of believers who come together. Again, that's sort of like the state. So you have the household, the church or the state, and then the cosmos. So what you had in the empire were two parallel realities. You had the Roman understanding of the cosmos, in which you'd actually see Caesar seated among the gods in heavenly places.
Right.
And then the state reflects that higher reality, that larger reality. And you see this all over the ancient world. Assyria, Mesopotamia, Egypt, it's just everywhere.
Right.
This is the way people thought. You can go to the Orient, same story in Japan and China, etc. So this is the way people thought. There's mimicry all the way up and down. So top level, mid level, on the ground. Doesn't end with the individual.
Okay.
It ends with the household. Individuals find their place in a household. So the idea that, the idea of a sort of a one-person household, it was absurd.
Right, right, yeah.
I mean, never would have thought of that. So you got to have more than one person for it to be a household. So this is the way it works. So what you have then is a competing understandings of the cosmos. So you have the principalities and powers. There are principalities and powers which are in rebellion, and these are the principalities and powers that the Romans worship. In other words, it just wasn't stuff they made up. It wasn't figments of their imagination. They just weren't superstitious. They actually believed in things that were real. So there were rebellious principalities and powers, and Caesar is part of that pantheon. And then you have over here with the Christian understanding, we have Christ, to whom every knee will bow and tongue will confess that he is Lord, including all those principalities and powers, including Caesar. So Christian households were modeled on a different cosmos, the true cosmos, not the cosmos that was in rebellion, but the cosmos that is the order and rule of the true God, the kingdom of God. So that's the setup. So that's why this is not an add-on. This is not like some sort of, and by the way, let me tell you, I know some of you guys are having some problems at home, so let's try to use Jesus as an example, and that kind of thing. That wasn't the way it worked.
Right. I'm going to swing back around to that in just a minute, so expect a follow-up question there. You've anticipated and answered the next question I was going to ask about the relationship between the cosmos and the oikos, so I think we can just kind of slide right past that one and get into the next question, which is, you ended your book talking about what you called guerrilla piety, which I thought was very interesting. So what do you mean when you talk about guerrilla piety and its relationship to the household?
Well, when we think about guerrilla fighters, we're talking about asymmetric warfare. We're talking about, how do you fight when you're just terribly outnumbered and your enemies, control the media, and they control the educational institutions of education, all this stuff, So you're just sort of like, what do you do?
Right.
Well,
you're outnumbered and outgunned and outmaneuvered. Now what?
That's right. But you can still do a lot of damage. In fact, asymmetric, sort of non-conventional warfare is really freaky from the standpoint of conventional forces.
Oh, yeah.
They don't know what to do with it. So guerrilla piety, pious, is a system of obligations that exists within a cosmological framework. So if we are attending to our duties in our households and reflecting the order of the true cosmos, we are undermining the false cosmos. We are guerrilla fighters. And one of the ways that we engage in guerrilla warfare is just in the course of our daily lives, doing things the way Paul outlines in Ephesians. Husbands loving their wives, wives respecting their husbands, these sorts of things, children submitting to parents. Now, you'd say, well, don't all those things, shouldn't all those things happen in other households that aren't part of our cosmos? Well, yeah, there is a kind of mixing, but there's also something to be said for knowing what you're doing and being able to point people in the right direction. And furthermore, when we think about these two orders, it's not so much that it's not necessarily the case that it's up to us to to manage to do this so well that we win. We've already won. I mean, Christ has already won the victory. He is seated at the right hand of the Father. It's inevitable that the principalities and powers will all submit. We're sort of heralds of the fact, and it's not because we're just so clever and so good and so obedient that we're going to bring down the principalities and powers of this world. That's not what I'm getting at. But we're a sign that it's over. In other
Right.
words, this is the new world. The new world is already on display in this household. Imperfectly on display, lots of problems with it still, but got men doing things maybe for egotistical reasons when they should be doing them for godly reasons, women doing things just because maybe that's the thing that they're expected to do and not really understanding how they're submitting to their husband actually reflects, the submission of the church to Christ, all of this kind of stuff. But nevertheless, as imperfect as it tends to be, we're announcing the end of the world just through the course of our daily lives.
So this is the follow-up question that I had just promised. You mentioned the relationship between the household, the cosmos, and eschatology.
Right.
And so that's one of the things that you do bring out in your book. So I'd like for you to talk about that just a little bit, that it's not insignificant that Genesis begins with a marriage and Revelation ends with a marriage feast. So would you mind delving into that a little bit for me and for the listener?
Yeah, I think that's tremendously significant. All the games that people are playing with marriage today, one of the reasons why they're playing with the marriage the way they are is because marriage points to something that they don't want to be true. And what marriage points to is God with us. It's referring to, when we think about the marriage feast, we're talking about this great celebration when there is this union between Christ and the church, and all of the riches that Christ deserves are imputed fully to us and realized in us as the church. And we rule with Christ,
Right.
the church as the bride, but who if you recall, there are there are little sort of hints throughout Scripture about a future, with regard to a future that it's very difficult for us to even, appreciate or conceive. And one of those little snippets is Paul's sort of offhanded reference to Christians judging angels, the church judging angels.
Right.
Like, what is that all about?
Right. Yeah.
And he throws it out sort of, like I said, in an offhanded way, like, oh, you guys know this.
Right.
I didn't
right.
know that.
Actually, I have no idea what's going on there, Paul. Why don't you dive into that a little deeper for us?
Right. But I think that the apostles had a sense that what's in store is just so marvelous, it's impossible for them to do it justice.
Yeah.
And Paul says that in effect elsewhere. But it does mean glory. It means exaltation. It means power. It means rule. It means all of these things. And that's the future that we have to look forward to, not because of anything we've done, but because of what's been done for us in Christ. So all of the things that we deserve, in other words, condemnation, death, and so forth, are imputed to Christ. And all the things that Christ deserved and deserves, glory, exaltation, rule,
Dignity.
are imputed to us. And we're in this in between time, the already and the not yet, but that's what we have to look forward to. And marriage is sort of the object lesson on the ground, just all the time being renewed at generation over generation, and it points to the end of the world.
Sure. So I want to end with this question because here on the True Presbyterian, we always kind of end with the experimental or experiential question. That's one of the things that we're kind of about here. I want to end this way. Can you give my listeners just kind of a few practical ways that they can leverage their household in our fight for the future?
Yeah, sure. I think the thing that you need to do to begin is work with your spouse. If you're a husband and you're listening to this podcast, or a wife listening to this podcast, you need to enter into with your spouse an understanding of your household and its significance at a level far beyond what you may have understood in the past, or the way you've seen it in the past. If you've more or less looked at your household as a place for through which you pursue personal gratification, then what you need to do is kind of take your way of thinking and conform it to what we see in Scripture. So I would say it happens at two levels. One level is kind of the practical stuff that we've talked about. If you can look at your household as a going concern, something that is productive, that is a great place to start. But if you can also think eschatologically, theologically, cosmologically about your household and what your household says. So, for example, when I work with engaged couples, I essentially tell them that you have a choice. Either your marriage will tell the story, your story, in other words, the story that ends when you die, and it's all about you, or your marriage can tell the story of the gospel. And if it's the second, then you're tying into something that's really big, and it's not about you, even though it's about you. If you get my drift.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So as a husband and father, you should think of yourself, as a man in a particular way. If you're a wife and a mother, you should think of yourself in a particular way within the framework of this larger gospel story.
Well, Chris, I can't thank you enough for coming on the show. I appreciate it very much. Thank you for giving us your time. And for the folks who are listening, we're getting ready to move into the after the interview segment where the shoes can come off, the fuzzy bunny slippers can go on, and you're certainly welcome to pour yourself a fine bourbon. So make sure you stick around for that. And I will talk to you all again very soon.